There is no greater love than a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her child. In the dying light of a Norse settlement, this truth becomes heartbreakingly real when 50-year-old Astrid faces an impossible choice. The giant warrior Ragnar has come for tribute, and her 21-year-old daughter Elska is his chosen prize. Without hesitation, Astrid steps forward. "Take me instead," she says, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. She knows what servitude to this legendary warrior means, but she would endure anything to spare her daughter this fate. Ragnar studies them both, the weathered mother who has given everything, and the young woman whose spirit remains unbroken. Then he makes a decision that shocks everyone. He takes them both. What follows is a journey that will test not just their survival, but the very bonds that define family. Will this unexpected path lead to their destruction, or something neither of them could have imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The iron bracelet around Astrid's wrist caught the last rays of sunlight as she stood in the doorway of her modest dwelling, watching the settlement come alive with morning activities. She had worn this simple band for 30 years now, since the day Elska was born, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between mother and child. Forged in iron as enduring as her love, the village of Thornwick nestled in a valley where the mountains met the sea, protected by towering peaks on 3 sides and open to the fjord on the 4th. Smoke curled from countless chimneys as families prepared their morning meals, the scent of cooking fish and fresh bread mingling with the salt air that never quite left this place. Children ran between the wooden houses, their laughter echoing off the stone foundations that had weathered countless winters. Astrid's home sat near the center of the settlement, close enough to the longhouse that she could hear the morning deliberations of the elders, yet far enough to maintain the quiet peace she had cultivated since her husband Bjorn's death 15 years ago. The dwelling itself was modest but sturdy, thick timber walls chinked with moss and clay, a roof of overlapping wooden shingles that had turned silver with age, and windows fitted with oiled leather that could be rolled up to let in the fresh mountain air. Inside, Elska moved with the graceful efficiency of a young woman who had learned to manage a household alongside her mother. At 21, she possessed a beauty that went beyond her golden hair and bright blue eyes. There was an intelligence in her gaze, a warmth in her smile that drew people to her like moths to flame. She hummed an old song as she worked, one that Astrid's own mother had sung, and the melody filled the small space with memories of generations past. "Mother, you're standing in the doorway again," Elska said without looking up from the loom where she worked on a length of wool cloth. "You only do that when something troubles you." Astrid smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. Even as a child, Elska had possessed an uncanny ability to read the emotions of those around her. It was a gift that had served her well in their close-knit community, where understanding the subtle currents of feeling could mean the difference between harmony and discord. "I was simply enjoying the morning," Astrid replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "And admiring your work." The wooden rune pendant around Elska's neck swayed as she leaned forward to adjust the threads on her loom. Astrid had carved that pendant herself when Elska was 7, inscribing it with runes for protection and wisdom. The wood had darkened with age and wear, but the symbols remained clear, a tangible link to the spiritual beliefs that had guided their family through joy and sorrow alike. Elska's current project was a cloak of deep blue wool. Dyed with berries, she had gathered herself in the high meadows. The work was intricate, with patterns woven in silver thread that caught the light as they moved. It would be beautiful when finished, a masterpiece worthy of a jarl's daughter. Yet Astrid knew it would likely never leave their village. Few here could afford such luxury, and fewer still had reason to wear it. "Tell me about your dreams again," Astrid said, settling onto a wooden stool beside the loom. "The ones where you travel beyond the mountains." Elska's hands stilled on the threads, and a soft smile crossed her face. I dream of great cities beside vast lakes, where people from many lands come to trade. I see myself walking through markets filled with spices and silks, with books written in languages I don't yet know. There are women there who run their own shops, who make decisions about important matters, who are valued for their minds as much as their beauty. It was a familiar conversation, one they had shared many times over the years. Astrid understood her daughter's longing for something larger than their small world, even as it filled her with a mother's natural worry. Thornwick was safe, predictable, bounded by traditions that had kept their people alive for generations. The wider world beyond their valley was full of dangers that Elska, for all her intelligence, could not fully comprehend. "And what of the life here?" Astrid asked gently. "Hakon's son has been making eyes at you since the summer festival. He would make a good husband, and his family's farm borders the best fishing grounds." Elska laughed, the sound bright and musical. "Eric is kind enough, but he looks at me like I'm a prize to be won, rather than a person with thoughts of my own. When I speak of the books old Magnus has shown me, or the stories the traders tell, his eyes grow distant. He wants a wife who will tend his hearth and bear his children, and never question the way things have always been done." Astrid felt a familiar tug in her chest, the tension between wanting to protect her daughter and knowing that protection often meant limiting her possibilities. She had been barely older than Elska when she married Bjorn, and while their union had been built on genuine affection and respect, she sometimes wondered what her life might have been if she had been born in a different time, a different place. "Not all men are like Eric," she said carefully. "Your father valued my counsel, encouraged me to speak my mind." "I know," Elska replied, her voice softening. "And I loved him for that." But father was unusual among the men of his generation. Most still believe a woman's place is determined by her husband's station, her value measured by her ability to produce sons. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horns echoing across the valley. Not the cheerful notes that announced visitors or celebrations, but the deep, ominous tones that spoke of serious matters. Astrid felt her blood chill as she recognized the sequence. 3 long blasts, followed by 2 short ones repeated twice. It was the signal for tribute collectors. Through the oiled leather window covering, they could see people emerging from their homes, faces tight with worry and fear. Children were quickly gathered and ushered inside, while the men of the village began to congregate near the longhouse. The women moved with practiced efficiency, hiding valuables and preparing for the worst. "Who do you think it is this time?" Elska asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Astrid replied, but she was lying. There had been rumors for weeks now. Whispered conversations that stopped when she drew near, worried glances exchanged between the elders. Word had spread of a new tribute collector working these lands, a giant of a man who took not gold or livestock, but people. Young, strong people who disappeared into the north and were never seen again. The sound of heavy footsteps outside made them both freeze. These were not the quick, nervous steps of villagers going about their business, but the measured tread of someone who moved with absolute confidence and authority. The footsteps stopped directly outside their door. A knock came, not the rapid tap of a neighbor or the polite rap of a friend, but 3 deliberate strikes that seemed to shake the very walls. Astrid's hand instinctively went to the iron bracelet on her wrist, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "Open," came a voice from outside, deep, commanding, with an accent that spoke of lands far to the north. "I would speak with those within." Astrid and Elska exchanged a look that contained a lifetime of understanding. Whatever was about to happen would change their lives forever. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, the half-finished cloak on the loom, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the carved runes that had blessed their threshold for so many years, they both sensed that their peaceful existence was about to end. Astrid rose slowly, her hand moving to the small knife at her belt, more from habit than any real hope of defense. She had been a shield maiden once, in the years before Elska's birth, and her body still remembered the weight of weapons and the readiness that came with facing the unknown. But those skills felt distant now, dulled by years of domestic life and the softening that came with peace. "Whatever happens," she whispered to Elska, "remember that you are loved. Remember that every choice I make is to protect you." Elska nodded, her hand clutching the rune pendant at her throat. In her eyes, Astrid saw not fear, but a quiet determination, the same strength that had carried their family through lean winters and harsh seasons, tempered now by the knowledge that their greatest test was yet to come. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Astrid walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and placed her hand on the carved handle. For just a moment she hesitated, knowing that once she opened this door, there would be no going back to the simple life they had built together. Then she lifted the latch and stepped into a future neither of them could have imagined. The door swung open to reveal a figure that seemed to fill the entire frame. Ragnar stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the morning light behind him. His hair, dark as winter nights, was braided with silver rings that caught the sunlight, and his beard was carefully groomed despite the obvious rigors of travel. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, pale blue like ice on a frozen lake, holding depths that spoke of experiences both terrible and profound. At his side hung an ancient war horn, carved from what appeared to be the tusk of some massive creature. The horn was bound with leather strips and adorned with runes that predated any script Astrid recognized. This was the instrument that had announced his arrival, its voice carrying the weight of destiny and the promise of change. "I am Ragnar Ironson," he said, his voice carrying the same authority as his presence. "I come at the behest of Jarl Magnus the Far-Travelled to collect what is owed." Behind him, Astrid could see other figures, men on horseback who waited at a respectful distance, their faces hidden beneath iron helms. They carried spears and shields, but their posture suggested discipline rather than aggression. These were not raiders come to pillage, but soldiers following orders with military precision. "What is owed?" Astrid asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The tribute agreed upon when last your village sought protection from the coastal raiders," Ragnar replied. "Gold was offered then, but gold holds little value in the harsh lands where I travel. I require something more precious, young blood, strong backs, willing hearts." Elska stepped forward, positioning herself slightly behind her mother, but visible nonetheless. Astrid felt her daughter's presence like a flame at her back, warm and vital and utterly precious. She wanted to push Elska back, to hide her from those ice-blue eyes, but she knew it was already too late. Ragnar's gaze moved from mother to daughter with the practiced assessment of someone who had made such evaluations countless times before. When he looked at Elska, something flickered across his features, not hunger or lust as Astrid had feared, but something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, or a kind of weary resignation. "You have a daughter of good age," he said simply. "She will come with me." The words fell into the small room like stones, into still water, creating ripples of shock and fear. Astrid felt her world tilt on its axis, all the careful plans and quiet hopes of 21 years suddenly reduced to this single, terrible moment. "No," she said, the word emerging with more force than she had intended. "Take me instead." Ragnar raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from professional assessment to something approaching curiosity. "You would offer yourself in place of your daughter?" "I would," Astrid replied without hesitation. "I am still strong, still capable. I have skills that a young woman has not yet learned. Take me and leave her to build the life she deserves." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Elska's breath came in short, sharp gasps behind her, and Astrid could feel her daughter's distress without needing to turn around. The men outside waited with the patient stillness of those accustomed to their leader's deliberations. Ragnar stepped closer, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire room. Up close, Astrid could see the scars that marked his hands and forearms, old wounds that spoke of countless battles and narrow escapes. There was a weariness in his face that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. the kind of soul-deep tiredness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for any one person. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Astrid Bjornsdottir," she replied. "Widow of Bjorn the Bold, daughter of Harald the Wise." "Astrid," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "And you believe your life has more value than hers?" It was a trap of words, Astrid realized. No matter how she answered, she would be diminishing either her own worth or her daughter's. But she had not survived 49 winters by being easily caught in such snares. "I believe," she said carefully, "that I have already lived most of my life, while she has barely begun hers. I believe that the love of a mother can make any sacrifice worthwhile. And I believe that you, whatever your reputation, are not a man who takes pleasure in destroying futures before they have a chance to unfold." Something shifted in Ragnar's expression at her words. The ice in his eyes seemed to warm slightly, as if she had touched upon some truth he had not expected to hear. He turned his attention to Elska, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, but whose presence seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. "And you, young one," he said, "do you accept your mother's bargain? Would you let her sacrifice herself for your freedom?" Elska's voice, when it came, was steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. "I would never ask such a thing of her, but I know her well enough to understand that she will not be deterred from this course, no matter what I say." "Wise words," Ragnar murmured. "And what if I told you that the choice is not yours to make? That I will take whom I choose, regardless of bargains or sacrifices?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Astrid felt her hand move instinctively toward the knife at her belt, knowing it would be useless against this giant, but needing the comfort of its familiar weight. She had faced death before, in the shield wall beside her husband, but that had been clean death in honest battle. This felt different, more personal, more devastating. "Then I would say," Astrid replied, her voice growing stronger with each word, "that you have the power to break hearts and destroy lives, but that power does not make you right. A true warrior considers the cost of his actions, not just their necessity." Ragnar was quiet for so long that Astrid began to wonder if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to press down on all of them. "I have walked many paths in my 43 years, he said. "I have seen mothers weep over empty cradles, daughters torn from their families, young men marched off to deaths they did not choose. I have been the instrument of such sorrows more times than I care to count." He paused, his gaze moving between mother and daughter with an expression that was impossible to read. "But I have also learned that sometimes the cruelest mercy is to refuse a sacrifice offered in love. You would spare your daughter, Astrid Bjornsdottir, but in doing so, you would rob her of the chance to face her own fate with courage. And you, Elska, would accept your mother's protection, but live forever knowing that her freedom was bought with your cowardice." The logic was brutal in its clarity, cutting through their hopes and fears with the precision of a well-honed blade. Astrid felt something crumble inside her chest, not defeat exactly, but the recognition that the simple solutions she had grasped for were slipping away like sand through her fingers. "What are you saying?" Elska asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ragnar straightened to his full height, his decision apparently made. When he spoke, his words fell like the final notes of a funeral song. "I am saying that I will take you both." The pronouncement struck them like a physical blow. Astrid felt her knees weaken, and only her grip on the doorframe kept her upright. Beside her, Elska made a small sound that might have been a sob or a prayer. "Both." Astrid managed both, Ragnar confirmed. The mother who would sacrifice everything for love, and the daughter who would accept such sacrifice out of that same love. "Together you will face whatever awaits in the north. Together you will discover whether the bonds that bind you are stronger than the forces that would break you." He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at them with something that might have been compassion. "You have 1 hour to gather what you can carry. Do not attempt to flee. My men know these mountains better than you do, and I have little patience for pursuit. When next I sound my horn, we ride." With that, he stepped back into the morning light, leaving mother and daughter alone with the wreckage of their world and the impossible reality of their shared fate. The hour passed like a fever dream, measured not in moments, but in the desperate efficiency of two women preparing for an uncertain future. Astrid moved through her home with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, gathering the essentials that might mean the difference between survival and suffering in the days ahead. Her battle-worn shield hung on the wall beside the hearth, its wooden surface scarred by countless encounters with sword and axe. The paint that had once decorated its face, a fierce wolf's head in blue and silver, had long since faded to ghostly traces, but the iron rim remained solid, the leather grip worn smooth by her hands during the years when she had stood in the shield wall beside her husband. Now, as she lifted it from its place of honor, the weight felt both familiar and strange, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. "You're taking it?" Elska asked, pausing in her own frantic preparations to watch her mother secure the shield to her traveling pack. "It may be the only protection we have," Astrid replied, testing the leather straps that would hold it in place. "And it carries more than just practical value. Your father's spirit blessed this shield and his father's before him. Whatever we face in the north, we'll face it with the strength of our ancestors." Elska nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. In their world, objects carried the weight of history, the accumulated power of those who had wielded them with honor. A shield was not merely wood and iron, but a repository of courage and determination passed down through generations. The sound of the war horn echoed across the valley, its deep note carrying the finality of fate. Ragnar was summoning them, and there would be no more delays. Astrid shouldered her pack, feeling the familiar distribution of weight across her shoulders. Traveling gear, cooking implements, spare clothing, and the small treasures that made life bearable in harsh circumstances. Outside, the village had gathered to witness their departure. Vases lined the pathways, some wet with tears, others tight with anger they dared not express. Children peered out from behind their parents, trying to understand why two of their own were being taken away. Old Magnus stood near the longhouse, his weathered hands clutching a walking stick carved with protective runes, his lips moving in what might have been prayers or curses. Ragnar waited beside 3 horses, massive beasts bred for endurance rather than speed, their coats dark as winter storms. His men had mounted and formed a loose column, ready to move at their leader's command. The giant himself stood with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the scene without apparent emotion. "Can you ride?" he asked as they approached. "We both can," Astrid replied, though she wondered how well after so many years of peaceful village life. The horses looked nothing like the gentle farm animals they had occasionally borrowed for trips to neighboring settlements. Ragnar gestured toward the smallest of the 3 mounts, a mare whose intelligent eyes and alert ears suggested both spirit and reliability. "This is Mist. She has carried many riders safely through difficult terrain. Trust her judgment when the path grows treacherous." As Elska approached the horse, Astrid caught sight of something unexpected, a moment of genuine care in Ragnar's expression as he watched her daughter. It was quickly masked, but she had seen it nonetheless, and the observation filed itself away in her mind as something potentially important. The first hours of their journey passed in relative silence. They rode south from Thornwick, following ancient paths that wound through the valley's lower reaches before turning north toward the high passes. The familiar landscape of home gradually gave way to wilder country, forests where the trees grew thick and dark, meadows where the grass stood tall enough to hide a crouching man, rocky outcroppings that offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain. Astrid found herself riding between Elska and Ragnar, positioned where she could protect her daughter from whatever threats might emerge from the wilderness ahead. But as the miles passed, she began to notice things that challenged her assumptions about their captor and his intentions. When Elska's horse stumbled on loose stone, Ragnar was immediately alert, his hand moving toward his reins as if to offer assistance. When they stopped to rest the horses, he personally checked the tightness of their saddle straps and the condition of their gear. When Elska complained quietly of thirst, he produced a leather waterskin without being asked and waited patiently while she drank her fill. These were not the actions of a man who viewed his prisoners as mere cargo. There was something else at work here, some purpose or motivation that went beyond simple tribute collection. Astrid found herself studying Ragnar's profile as he rode ahead of them, trying to read the thoughts behind those ice-blue eyes. "Why did you take us both?" she asked during one of their rest stops, her voice pitched low enough that the other men would not overhear. Ragnar was silent for so long that she began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were choosing each one with care. "Have you ever seen a wolf pack hunt, Astrid Bjornsdottir?" The question seemed unrelated to her own, but she nodded. "Many times. Then you know that they do not simply chase down the weakest member of the herd. They work together, some driving the prey toward others who wait in ambush, some cutting off escape routes while others move in for the kill. Their strength comes not from individual prowess, but from their bonds with one another. And what does that have to do with us?" Ragnar's gaze moved to where Elska sat braiding flowers she had gathered into her horse's mane, her face serene despite their circumstances. "Alone, each of you has certain strengths. The mother with her experience and wisdom, the daughter with her youth and adaptability. But together," he paused, seeming to search for the right words, "together, you have something that cannot be easily broken or corrupted. Something that may prove more valuable than either gold or individual servitude." It was the longest speech he had made since taking them from their home, and Astrid sensed that it revealed more about his character than he had intended. This was not a man driven by simple greed or cruelty, but someone operating according to a logic that she did not yet understand. "Where are you taking us?" she asked. "North," he replied, offering no additional detail. "That tells me nothing. For now." "It tells you enough." The conversation ended there, but Astrid carried his words with her as they resumed their journey. A wolf pack, bonds that could not be broken, strength that came from unity rather than individual power. She glanced at Elska, who rode with the easy grace of youth, apparently untroubled by the uncertainty of their destination. Whatever Ragnar's true purpose, whatever challenges awaited them in the north, Astrid began to understand that their survival might depend not on escape or resistance, but on maintaining the connection that bound them together. The iron bracelet on her wrist caught the afternoon light, and she drew strength from its familiar weight, a reminder that some bonds were indeed forged too strong to break. On the third day of their journey, when they made camp beside a mountain stream that sang with the voice of distant glaciers, Elska began to work with the golden thread she had carried from home. The delicate strands caught the firelight as she wove them into small patterns, not the complex designs she had created on her loom, but simple protective symbols that could be completed with just her fingers and the memories passed down from her grandmother. "What are you making?" Ragnar asked, settling beside the fire with the easy grace of someone accustomed to sleeping under open skies. His men had taken positions around the perimeter of their camp, silent sentinels who melted into the shadows between the trees. "Binding knots," Elska replied, her voice still carrying the musical quality that had charmed the young men of Thornwick. "My grandmother taught them to me when I was small. She said that when you're far from home, you can weave a little of that home into something you can carry." Astrid watched the exchange with growing fascination. This was the first time Ragnar had initiated casual conversation with either of them, and she could see genuine curiosity in his expression as he studied her daughter's delicate work. "May I see?" he asked. Elska hesitated, glancing at her mother for guidance. Astrid nodded slightly, and her daughter extended her hands to show the small creation taking shape between her fingers, a complex knot that seemed to shift and change as the firelight played across its golden surface. "Beautiful," Ragnar said quietly, "and practical. Such knots can mark a trail, identify friendly territory, even carry messages between those who understand their meaning. You know the old ways? Elska asked, surprise evident in her voice. I know many things, Ragnar replied. When you travel as widely as I have, you learn that wisdom takes different forms in different places. The mountain folk have their stone cairns, the forest dwellers their tree markings, the coastal people their tide pools filled with arranged shells. All ways of leaving traces for those who know how to read them. He reached into his traveling pack and withdrew something that made both women catch their breath, a small carved figure, no larger than a child's fist, that seemed to contain an entire world of detail within its wooden surface. It was clearly ancient, the wood darkened with age and polished smooth by countless hands, but every line and curve remained perfectly preserved. This was carved by my great-grandmother, he said, holding it so the firelight illuminated its intricate features. She was a vulva, a wise woman who could read the patterns in smoke and water, who could speak with spirits and understand the language of dreams. When she died, this was the only thing she left behind, but it carries more of her wisdom than any spoken teaching could convey. Astrid leaned closer, studying the figure with the eye of someone who had seen many such carvings. This was no simple decoration or child's toy, but a work of profound spiritual significance. The figure appeared to be a woman, but her face held qualities that transcended simple humanity. There was something of the wolf in her expression, something of the raven, something of the eternal mother who watches over all living things. She looks fierce, Elska observed. She was, Ragnar agreed. But her fierceness came from love, not anger. She told me once that the greatest strength a person could possess was the willingness to protect what mattered most. Even if it meant walking into darkness, the words carried layers of meaning that Astrid was only beginning to understand. She thought of her own willingness to sacrifice herself for Elska, of the desperate bargain she had tried to make in their doorway 3 days ago. Was Ragnar suggesting that he understood such motivations? That his own actions were driven by similar impulses? Why are you showing us this? She asked. Ragnar was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing the carved features of the figure. Because I want you to understand that this journey we're taking together, it's not what you think it is. Then what is it? Instead of answering directly, he turned his attention to the fire, adding wood with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made countless such camps. Tell me about your husband, he said to Astrid. Beyond the bold, what kind of man was he? The question caught her off guard, but something in Ragnar's tone, respectful, genuinely interested, encouraged her to answer. He was a good man, she said slowly. Strong in battle, but gentle at home. He never raised his voice to me or Elska, never demanded obedience through fear. He believed that a family should be like a ship's crew, each person contributing their strengths, all working toward the same destination. And what was that destination? A life worth living, Astrid replied without hesitation. A home where children could grow up safe and loved, where neighbors looked after one another, where the old wisdom was passed down alongside new knowledge. A life worth living, Ragnar repeated, as if testing the weight of the phrase. Yes, that's a goal worth pursuing. Elska had continued working with her golden thread throughout the conversation, and now she held up a completed piece, a small circular pattern that seemed to glow in the firelight. It's finished, she said. A binding knot for safe travels. For yourself? Ragnar asked. Elska shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. For you. Whatever your true purpose in bringing us north, I sense that you carry burdens you haven't shared. Perhaps this will bring you some comfort. She extended the golden creation toward him, and for a moment Astrid thought he might refuse it. His face showed a complex mix of emotions, surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been pain. When he finally accepted the gift, his large hands handled it with the same careful reverence he had shown for his great-grandmother's carving. Thank you, he said quietly. It has been many years since anyone has offered me such a kindness. He tucked the binding knot into his tunic, close to his heart, and Astrid realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer simply captor and prisoners. but three people bound together by circumstances that none of them fully understood. As the fire burned lower and the mountain night settled around them, Astrid found herself thinking about the threads that connected all living things, some visible, like Elska's golden weaving, others invisible, but no less real. Whatever lay ahead in their journey north, she began to sense that they would face it not as enemies forced together by necessity, but as something approaching allies, united by bonds that grew stronger with each passing day. The ancient waystone stood at the crossroads like a silent sentinel, its weathered surface carved with runes so old that even Ragnar paused to study them with reverence. The massive granite pillar rose twice the height of a man, its edges worn smooth by countless seasons of wind and rain. Yet the symbols etched into its face remained clear enough to read for those who knew the old script. "What does it say?" Elska asked, dismounting from her horse to examine the markings more closely. 7 days of travel had changed her. The soft roundness of village life had given way to lean strength, and her eyes held a new alertness that spoke of adaptation to the wider world. Ragnar traced one of the runes with his finger, his expression thoughtful. "It speaks of choices," he said. "The left path leads to the settlements of the coastal jarls, where gold flows like water and men measure their worth in silver. The right path climbs into the high mountains, where the air grows thin and only the strongest survive. And straight ahead," he paused, studying the central symbol that seemed to shift in the afternoon light. "Straight ahead lies the old road, the one our ancestors walked when the world was younger and the barriers between realms were not so solid." Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The old road. She had heard whispers of such places in the stories her grandmother told, paths that led not just through physical space, but through the layers of reality itself. Places where the living might encounter the dead, where the future cast shadows into the present, where the gods still walked among mortals. "Which way do we go?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Straight ahead," Ragnar replied, as she had known he would. "But first, we rest here tonight. This is a place of power, and it demands respect. We'll make our offerings to the spirits that guard this crossroads, and in the morning we'll continue on the path that has been chosen for us." As his men began to set up camp around the waystone, Astrid noticed something that had escaped her attention during the day's ride. The soldiers who followed Ragnar were not the brutal warriors she had expected, but men of discipline and honor. They moved with quiet efficiency, showing consideration for the land they traveled through, leaving no trace of their passage beyond the necessary. When they spoke among themselves, their voices carried the easy camaraderie of comrades who had shared many campaigns together. "Your men," she said to Ragnar as they gathered wood for the evening fire. "They're not what I expected." "And what did you expect?" "Raiders, berserkers, men who take pleasure in causing pain." Ragnar was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the kindling he was arranging. "I have known such men," he said finally. "I have fought beside them and against them, but the warriors who follow me now are different. They serve not for the promise of gold or the thrill of violence, but because they believe in something larger than themselves." "What do they believe in?" "That the old ways are dying," he replied. "That the world our children inherit will be smaller, safer, but also emptier of wonder and meaning. They follow me because I have promised them a chance to preserve something precious before it disappears forever." Before Astrid could ask what he meant, a commotion arose from the edge of their camp. 3 of Ragnar's men had returned from scouting the path ahead, and their faces carried news that was clearly unwelcome. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their words too quiet to overhear, but their body language speaking of danger and difficult decisions. Ragnar listened to their report with the stillness of a predator assessing a threat. When they finished speaking, he nodded once and dismissed them with a gesture. Then he turned to face Astrid and Elska, his expression grave. "There are others on the old road," he said. "Men who serve a different master, who have different purposes for traveling these paths. They're camped perhaps 2 hours ahead of us, directly blocking the way forward. Who are they? Astrid asked, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife at her belt. Servants of Jarl Eric the Bloodthirsty, Ragnar replied, and Astrid felt her blood chill at the name. Eric's reputation had reached even their remote valley, a man who ruled through terror, who delighted in breaking the spirits of those who opposed him. They seek the same destination we do, but for very different reasons, and you think they'll try to stop us? I know they will. Eric has long opposed what I represent, what I'm trying to preserve. If he learns that I travel this road with companions who carry the kind of power you possess—" He stopped himself, as if realizing he had said more than he intended. "What power?" Elska asked, stepping closer to her mother. "We're just village women. We have no magic, no special abilities." Ragnar's smile was sad and knowing. "You have something far more dangerous than magic, young one. You have the ability to inspire hope in those who have forgotten how to dream, to kindle courage in hearts that have grown cold with despair. Eric understands that such gifts pose a greater threat to his rule than any army. The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Astrid began to understand that their journey was part of something much larger than a simple tribute collection, a struggle between different visions of what their world should become. "What do you propose we do?" she asked. "We have 3 choices," Ragnar replied, echoing the Waystone's ancient message. "We can turn back, abandoning our destination and accepting defeat. We can try to go around them, adding days to our journey and risking ambush in unfamiliar territory. Or we can go forward, trusting in our bonds and our purpose to see us through whatever obstacles they place in our path." Astrid looked at her daughter, seeing in Elska's eyes the same determination that had carried their family through countless challenges. The golden thread still gleamed in her hair, where she had woven some of it among her braids, and the rune pendant at her throat caught the last light of the setting sun. "We go forward," Elska said before her mother could speak. "We didn't come this far to turn back at the first sign of real danger." Ragnar nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true daughter of warriors. Very well. We'll rest tonight in the protection of the Waystone, and in the morning we'll see what courage and wisdom can accomplish against mere brute force." As darkness settled around them, Astrid found herself studying the ancient runes by firelight, searching for guidance from the ancestors who had walked this path before them. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Waystone, mist rising from the valley below like the breath of sleeping giants. Ragnar stood at the edge of their camp, his father's war-axe in his hands, not held ready for battle, but cradled with the reverence one might show a sacred relic. The weapon was magnificent in its deadly simplicity, its double-bladed head forged from steel so fine it seemed to drink in the morning light. Its ash handle worn smooth by generations of warrior hands. Astrid approached quietly, not wanting to disturb what was clearly a moment of deep contemplation. She had seen men prepare for battle before, had stood beside Bjorn during the coastal raids 15 years past, but there was something different about Ragnar's stillness. This was not the focused aggression of a warrior readying himself for violence, but the quiet resignation of someone accepting a burden he had hoped never to bear again. "Your father's axe?" she asked softly. "And his father's before him," Ragnar replied without turning. "It has been in my family for 7 generations, passed down from father to son, along with the responsibilities that come with wielding it. My great-great-grandfather carried it when he first walked the old roads, seeking wisdom from the spirits that dwell between worlds." The weapon seemed to pulse with its own inner light as he spoke, as if responding to the weight of history in his words. Astrid could see now that the steel was marked with intricate patterns, not mere decoration, but runes of power woven into the very metal during its forging. "And what responsibility comes with such a blade?" she asked. For the first time since she had known him, Ragnar looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "To protect those who cannot protect themselves," he said. "To stand against the darkness that would consume all light and beauty in the world." to ensure that the old wisdom is not lost when the last of the wise women passes beyond the veil. His words carried layers of meaning that Astrid was only beginning to grasp. She thought of the carved figure he had shown them by the fire, of his great-grandmother, the Völva, who had seen truths hidden from ordinary eyes. Was that what this journey was truly about? The preservation of ancient knowledge in a world that was forgetting its own history? "The men who block our path," she said. "They serve someone who would see that wisdom destroyed." "Eric the Bloodthirsty cares nothing for wisdom, old or new," Ragnar replied, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "He sees only power and the means to acquire more of it. The old roads, the sacred places, the keepers of forgotten lore. To him they are obstacles to his vision of absolute control." Elska emerged from the camp behind them, her movements quiet as morning mist. She had been listening, Astrid realized, and her daughter's face showed the same troubled understanding that was growing in her own heart. "That's why you really took us, isn't it?" Elska said. "Not for tribute or servitude, but because you needed us for something else." Ragnar turned to face them both, and Astrid saw in his pale eyes a weariness that spoke of years of carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear. "Your mother possesses the wisdom of the old ways," he said carefully. "Her knowledge of herb lore, of the songs that heal and protect, of the traditions that bind communities together. Such things are becoming rare in our changing world. And you, Elska, you have the gift of sight." "I don't understand," Elska said, though her hand moved unconsciously to the rune pendant at her throat. "The binding knot you wove for me," Ragnar continued. "You created it not just with thread and skill, but with intent and power. When you looked at me by the firelight, you saw past the surface to the pain I carry, the burden that drives me forward. That is a rare gift, one that my great-grandmother would have recognized and honored." Astrid felt pieces of a vast puzzle beginning to align in her mind. "Where are you taking us, Ragnar? What is our true destination?" "There is a place," he said slowly, "hidden in the high mountains where the old roads converge. A sanctuary built by the first voleurs, where the most precious knowledge of our people has been preserved for 1,000 years. It is tended by the last of the wise women, and she is dying." The simple statement fell between them like a stone into still water, its implications rippling outward in ever-widening circles. Astrid understood now why Eric's men would try to stop them, why Ragnar had been willing to take such risks to bring them on this journey. "She needs a successor," Elska whispered. "She needs 2 successors," Ragnar corrected. "The old knowledge requires both wisdom and vision to survive, experience to understand its depths, and youth to ensure its continuation. Together you could preserve something invaluable. Apart," he left the sentence unfinished, but they all understood its meaning. A shout from one of the scouts interrupted their conversation. The man was pointing toward the old road, where a column of riders had appeared in the distance. Even at this range, their aggressive posture was unmistakable, weapons gleaming in the morning light, banners snapping in the mountain wind, horses prancing with barely contained violence. "Eric's men," Ragnar said grimly. "They've decided not to wait for us to come to them." Astrid counted the approaching riders, her warrior's eye automatically assessing their strength and disposition. 20 men, maybe 25. All mounted, all armed for war. We are 12, Ragnar replied. But we have advantages they lack, such as... His smile was grim, but not without hope. We fight for something larger than ourselves. We carry the blessings of the ancestors. And we have you. Elska stepped forward, her young face set with determination that reminded Astrid powerfully of her deceased husband. What do you need us to do? Be who you are, Ragnar said simply. Trust in the bonds that unite us. And remember that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through strength of arms, but through strength of spirit. He raised his father's axe, and the runes along its blade seemed to flare within a fire. Around them, his men moved into position with the quiet efficiency of veterans who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. As the enemy riders drew closer, Astrid felt something she had not experienced in years, the fierce joy of standing with worthy companions against a common foe. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The battle erupted with the fury of thunder splitting the mountain air, but it was over almost before it began. Eric's riders charged up the slope toward the waystone with wild war cries and gleaming weapons, expecting to overwhelm Ragnar's smaller force through sheer brutality. What they found instead was a carefully orchestrated defense that turned their own momentum against them. Ragnar's men had positioned themselves among the ancient stones that surrounded the crossroads, using the sacred ground itself as a fortress. When the attackers reached the crest of the hill, they found not a desperate band of travelers, but disciplined warriors who fought with the precision of men, defending something sacred. The clash of steel on steel rang out across the mountainside as Astrid found herself swept into combat for the first time in 15 years. Her battle-worn shield felt solid and reassuring in her grip, its familiar weight awakening muscle memories she had thought lost to domestic life. When a rider broke through the line of defenders and charged toward where Elska crouched behind the waystone, Astrid intercepted him with movements that flowed like water, deflecting his sword thrust with her shield, spinning inside his guard, driving her seax deep into his ribs with surgical precision. But even as she fought, part of her mind remained focused on something else, a wrongness in the attack that she couldn't quite identify. Eric's men were fierce enough, but their assault lacked the calculated savagery she had expected from the bloodthirsty forces. They seemed almost reluctant, as if their hearts weren't truly in the fight. The answer came when the last of the attackers fell, and their leader, a grizzled veteran with silver in his beard, raised his hand in surrender rather than fighting to the death. "Enough," he called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "The ruse has served its purpose." Ragnar lowered his father's axe, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the surrendering warrior with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Was it convincing enough, Tormund?" Astrid felt the world tilt beneath her feet as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. This had not been a real battle at all, but an elaborate deception. The enemy leader approached Ragnar not as a defeated foe, but as an old friend, and the two men clasped forearms in the greeting of sworn companions. "Convincing enough," Tormund replied with a weathered smile. "Though your shield maiden there nearly split my skull for real. She's lost none of her edge, despite the years of peace. What is happening here?" Astrid demanded, her voice sharp with betrayal and confusion. "Who are these men? What game are you playing, Ragnar?" Ragnar's expression grew solemn as he gestured for his supposed enemies to join their group around the waystone. "These are my kinsmen," he said simply. "Warriors sworn to the same cause we serve, but who could not openly travel with us without arousing the suspicions of those who watch the old roads." "You staged the entire battle?" Elska asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "We had to," Tormund explained, settling beside the fire that one of his men had quickly kindled. "There are eyes in these mountains, spies who serve masters we dare not name. They needed to see Ragnar's party reduced, bloodied, apparently weakened by our attack. What they will report is that the tribute collector barely escaped with his life and his prisoners. Hardly a threat worth pursuing." Astrid sank down onto a stone, her mind reeling as she tried to process the implications of what she had learned. "How much of this journey has been false?" she asked. "How much have you lied to us?" "The destination is real," Ragnar said quietly. "The dying Velva is real. Your importance to preserving the old wisdom, that is all true. But the path to get there, the dangers we face, the way we must navigate the political currents of our time, those require deception." From his traveling pack, Tormund withdrew a leather satchel that he handled with extraordinary care. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, was a letter written on parchment so old it was nearly transparent. The script was in the ancient runes, but even without being able to read the words, Astrid could sense the power and sorrow contained within. This was found among Eric the Bloodthirsty's possessions after his death 3 months ago, Tormund said, extending the letter toward Ragnar. We thought you should see it before we reach the sanctuary. Ragnar's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the ancient document. As his eyes moved across the runic script, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, grief, understanding, and finally a profound sadness that seemed to age him before their eyes. What does it say? Elska asked softly. Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the edge of the parchment with infinite care. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, given new context. It's from my beloved, he said slowly. Ingrid. She was taken by raiders 7 years ago while I was away on a journey to the eastern lands. I searched for months, followed every lead, pursued every rumor, but found no trace of her. I believed she was dead. He paused, struggling with emotions that clearly cut to the very core of his being. According to this letter, she was sold to Eric not as a slave, but as a gift for the Vulva, a young woman with the sight who could serve as apprentice and eventual successor. She lived in the mountain sanctuary for 3 years, learning the old ways, growing in wisdom and power. And then his voice broke slightly. Then she sacrificed herself to prevent Eric from learning the location of the sacred place. The revelation hit them all like a physical blow. Astrid felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood the terrible irony. Ragnar had been seeking to replace the woman he loved with other women who possessed similar gifts, not knowing that it was his own beloved's death that had created the need for successors. That's why you really took us both, Elska whispered. Not just to preserve the old knowledge, but to honor her sacrifice by ensuring it wasn't in vain. Ragnar nodded, unable to speak past the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The letter fluttered in the mountain breeze, its ancient words carrying the weight of love and loss across the years. There's more, Tormund said gently. The Vulva, the one we seek to serve, she was Ingrid's teacher. According to the letter, she made Ingrid promise that if anything happened to her, suitable successors would be found to continue the work. Women of wisdom and vision who could preserve what must not be lost. Astrid felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with crystalline clarity. She described us, she said. In the letter, she told the Vulva to look for a mother and daughter, bound by love strong enough to sacrifice everything for each other. She saw you in her visions, Ragnar confirmed, his voice rough with grief and wonder. Months before I ever came to your village, she knew that you would be the ones to fulfill her final wish. The ancient waystones seemed to pulse with inner light as the truth settled around them like morning mist. The journey was not just about preserving knowledge or honoring the past. It was about love transcending death, about promises kept across the veil between worlds, about the unbreakable bonds that connected all those who chose to serve something greater than themselves. As they prepared to continue toward their destination, Astrid realized that everything she thought she knew about their situation had been transformed. They were not prisoners on a forced march, but pilgrims on a sacred journey, following a path laid out by a woman whose love had reached across death itself to guide them home. The path to the sanctuary wound through passes so high that breathing became labored, and the world below disappeared into clouds that clung to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping gods. With each step higher into the ancient peaks, Astrid felt the weight of her mother's silver arm ring pressing against her skin, a tangible reminder of the unbroken chain of women's wisdom that stretched back through countless generations. She had worn the ring since her wedding day, when her dying mother had pressed it into her palm with hands that trembled from fever, but held firm with purpose. The silver was old beyond counting, its surface worn smooth by the touch of women who had faced their own impossible choices, who had carried their own burdens of love and duty and sacrifice. Now, as they climbed toward their destiny, Astrid drew strength from its familiar presence and from the knowledge that she was part of something larger than herself. The air grows thin, Elska observed, pausing to catch her breath on a narrow ledge that offered a brief respite from the climb. Her cheeks were flushed with exertion, but her eyes held a brightness that spoke of anticipation rather than fatigue. How much farther? Ragnar consulted the crude map that Tormund had provided, little more than scratches on birch bark, but detailed enough to show the landmarks they needed to find. Another day, perhaps two, he replied. The sanctuary is hidden in a valley that can only be reached through the Pass of Echoes. Legend says that the voices of all who have died in these mountains can be heard there, calling to those who seek wisdom. The expanded party, now numbering nearly 30 warriors, moved with the quiet efficiency of men who understood the sacred nature of their mission. Tormund's fighters had proven themselves to be honorable companions, sharing their supplies freely and taking turns breaking trail through the deepest snow. There was something almost ceremonial about their procession, as if they were not merely traveling through difficult terrain, but participating in a ritual that had been repeated by countless pilgrims over the centuries as they made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow carved from the living rock. Astrid found herself thinking about the woman whose sacrifice had made their journey possible. Ingrid remained a mystery, known to them only through the letter she had left behind, and the love that had shaped Ragnar's every action since her loss. What had she been like in life? What dreams had she carried? What fears had she faced when she chose to die rather than reveal the sanctuary's location to Eric's torturers? Tell me about her, Astrid said to Ragnar as they sat beside the fire, watching Elska work her golden thread into another of her protective patterns. Tell me about Ingrid. Ragnar's hands stilled on the piece of wood he had been carving, a small figure that bore a striking resemblance to the vulva sculpture his great-grandmother had left him. For a moment, Astrid thought he might refuse to answer, but then he set down his knife and stared into the dancing flames. She had a laugh like water running over stones, he said quietly. When she was happy, truly happy, her whole face would light up and everyone around her couldn't help but smile. She saw beauty in things others overlooked, the way frost patterns formed on window coverings, the sound the wind made when it moved through different types of trees, the colors that appeared in puddles after rain. His voice grew softer as he continued, memory painting pictures that only he could see. She used to say that the gods spoke to mortals through small things, the flight of birds, the arrangement of clouds, the way certain flowers opened only at twilight. She could read meaning in patterns that escaped everyone else, could see connections between events that seemed completely unrelated. She sounds like she was born to be a vulva, Elska observed, her fingers never pausing in their intricate work. Perhaps she was, Ragnar agreed. But she was also born to be loved and to love in return. That was her greatest gift and her greatest burden. She felt the pain of others as if it were her own, rejoiced in their happiness as if it belonged to her. When she was taken, part of me died with her. When I learned of her sacrifice, I understood that she had found a way to transform even that ultimate loss into something meaningful. Tormund approached their fire, his weathered face grave with the weight of news that could not wait for morning. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "My scouts report movement in the passes behind us. Someone is following our trail." "How many?" Ragnar asked, instantly alert. Difficult to say in this terrain, but at least a dozen riders. They're pushing hard, traveling light, making no attempt at concealment. They want us to know they're coming. Astrid felt ice form in her stomach. Who would dare pursue us this high in the mountains? Eric had allies, Tormund replied grimly. Men who shared his vision of absolute power, who saw the old ways as obstacles to be eliminated rather than treasures to be preserved. Chief among them is Gunnar the Cruel, Eric's cousin and chosen successor. If he's learned of our mission, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood what it would mean if hostile forces reached the sanctuary. The knowledge preserved there for 1,000 years would be destroyed, the last vulva murdered, and any hope of passing the ancient wisdom to future generations would die with her. How long do we have? Ragnar asked. They're perhaps 6 hours behind us, maybe 8 if the weather holds. But they're mounted and we're on foot now. The path ahead is too treacherous for horses. Ragnar studied the crude map again, his finger tracing possible routes through the maze of peaks and valleys that lay ahead. The Pass of Echoes is still half a day's climb from here. If we push through the night, we might reach it before they catch us. But if we're caught in the open, on those narrow trails with no cover, we'll be slaughtered. Tormund finished. Astrid looked around the circle of faces illuminated by the firelight. Warriors who had pledged their lives to this cause, men who understood that some things were worth dying for. She thought of her peaceful village, of the quiet life she had built with Elska, of all the small daily pleasures they had taken for granted. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this moment not just by miles of treacherous mountain terrain, but by choices that had changed them forever. "There is another way," she said slowly, an idea forming in her mind that was both desperate and strangely fitting. "What if we didn't all go to the sanctuary together?" "What do you mean?" Elska asked. "The knowledge that must be preserved. It requires both of us, yes? The experienced woman and the gifted youth. But it doesn't require all of these warriors. What if most of the men stayed behind to delay the pursuers, while a small group escorted us to the Volva?" Ragnar shook his head immediately. "Too dangerous. If something happened to the escort party, if you were captured or killed, everything would be lost. And if Gunnar's forces reach the sanctuary, everything will be lost anyway," Astrid countered. "At least this way, we have a chance." The debate continued around the fire as the night deepened, and the mountain wind carried the sound of their voices into the darkness. Plans were proposed and discarded, strategies considered and rejected, until finally a consensus emerged that satisfied no one but seemed to offer the best hope of success. They would split their forces. The majority of the warriors would remain to set an ambush in the narrow defile through which their pursuers must pass, buying time with their lives if necessary. Meanwhile, Ragnar would lead a small group, himself, Astrid, Elska, and 4 of his most trusted men, on a desperate forced march through the Pass of Echoes to the sanctuary. As they prepared to leave their fire and continue the climb in darkness, Astrid felt the silver arm ring pulse with warmth against her skin. She thought of her mother, of her grandmother, of all the women who had worn this ring before her, and faced their own moments of truth with courage and grace. The chain of wisdom that connected them across the centuries was about to be tested as never before. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, whatever price they had to pay for the chance to preserve something precious, she would meet it as her ancestors had, with dignity, with love, and with the unshakable knowledge that some things were worth any sacrifice. The mountain peaks stood sentinel around them as they began their final ascent, ancient guardians watching over pilgrims who carried the future of their people in their hearts and hands. The Pass of Echoes earned its name in the pre-dawn darkness as their small party picked their way through the narrow defile between towering peaks. Every footstep, every whispered word, every labored breath seemed to bounce endlessly between the stone walls, creating a symphony of sound that spoke of all those who had passed this way before. Astrid could swear she heard voices in the reverberations, ancient tongues speaking words of encouragement, warning, and blessing to the pilgrims who walked in their footsteps. At the heart of the pass stood the sacred grove's ancient oak, a massive tree that defied all logic by growing from bare rock at an altitude where no tree should survive. Its trunk was so large that it would take a dozen people joining hands to encircle it, and its branches reached up into the darkness like the arms of a god embracing the star-filled sky. The bark was carved with thousands of runes, prayers, promises, and pleas left by countless generations of travelers who had sought the oak's blessing. "How is it possible?" Elska whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she approached the impossible tree. "There's no soil here, no water source. By all natural law, this should be barren stone." Ragnar placed his hand against the ancient bark, and Astrid could see his face soften with something approaching reverence. "The first Volur planted this oak 1,000 years ago," he said quietly. "They say it grows not from earth and water, but from the accumulated wisdom of all who have passed beneath its branches. Every seeker who has walked this path has left something of themselves here, and the tree has grown stronger with each gift. as if responding to his words. The oak's leaves rustled in a wind that touched nothing else in the pass. The sound was like whispered voices speaking in harmony, and Astrid felt a presence settling around them, not threatening, but ancient beyond measure and heavy with the weight of accumulated knowledge. "We should make an offering," she said, the words emerging without conscious thought. "Something to show our respect, to ask for the tree's blessing on our mission, without hesitation." She removed the silver arm ring from her wrist, the precious heirloom that had connected her to generations of strong women who had faced their own trials with grace and courage. The metal felt warm in her palm, as if it had absorbed not just the heat of her body, but the love and determination of all who had worn it before. "Are you certain?" Ragnar asked, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. "Once given to the tree, it cannot be reclaimed." "I'm certain," Astrid replied. "This ring has carried the strength of my mothers through every challenge they faced. Now it will help carry our strength to those who come after us." She approached the massive trunk and found a hollow in the bark that seemed shaped specifically for her offering. As she placed the ring within the depression, the silver seemed to pulse with inner light before sinking into the wood, as if the tree were accepting it into its very substance. The change was immediate and profound. The whispered voices in the wind grew clearer, more distinct, and among them Astrid heard something that made her heart leap. Her mother's voice, speaking words of love and encouragement across the veil between worlds. Beside her, Elska gasped and reached for her hand, tears streaming down her face as she too recognized the voice of her grandmother, offering blessings on their sacred mission. But there was another voice among the chorus, one that made Ragnar's entire body go rigid with shock and wonder. Ingrid's voice, clear as mountain water and warm as summer sunlight, speaking directly to the man who had loved her beyond death itself. "My beloved," the voice whispered through the rustling leaves, "you have brought them home to me. The circle is complete, the promise fulfilled. What was lost has been found. What was broken has been made whole. Love transcends all boundaries, even death itself." The moment stretched like eternity, filled with the presence of those who had gone before and the promise of those yet to come. The ancient oak seemed to pulse with life, its branches reaching higher toward the stars, its roots digging deeper into the living rock that sustained it. Then, from somewhere far below in the pass, came the sound they had all been dreading, the clash of steel on steel, the shouts of men in battle, the war cries of Tormund's warriors as they made their desperate stand against Gunnar's pursuing forces. The ambush had been sprung, and brave men were dying to buy them the time they needed to complete their mission. "We must go," Ragnar said, his voice thick with emotion as Ingrid's presence faded back into the chorus of ancestors. "The sanctuary lies just ahead, beyond the grove. Every moment we delay here costs lives below." As they prepared to leave the sacred grove behind, Astrid felt a profound sense of transformation settling over all of them. They were no longer the same people who had begun this journey days ago. They had been touched by something eternal, blessed by the accumulated wisdom of ages, changed in ways that would echo through the rest of their lives. The path ahead led upward still, toward a destiny that awaited them among the highest peaks of the world. The sanctuary revealed itself at dawn like a dream emerging from the realm of sleep. Hidden in a circular valley surrounded by peaks that touched the very dome of the sky, it was a place that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. Ancient buildings carved from the living rock nestled against terraced gardens, where impossible plants bloomed in defiance of the harsh mountain climate. At the center of it all stood a modest wooden hall, its timbers weathered silver by centuries of wind and snow, but its foundations solid as the eternal mountains themselves. The last Völva waited for them in the doorway, and Astrid felt her breath catch at the sight of this legendary figure. She was ancient beyond counting, her white hair flowing like snowfall to her waist, her face lined with the wisdom of decades spent in communion with forces beyond mortal understanding. Yet her eyes, pale blue like Ragnar's own, held depths that spoke of power undiminished by age, of knowledge that had been carefully tended through generations of faithful guardianship. "Welcome, daughters of my heart," the Vulva said, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through the high places. "I am Sigrid, last keeper of the old ways, and I have been waiting for you longer than you know." Behind them, the sound of pursuit had grown closer during their final ascent. Gunnar's forces had broken through the ambush below. The silence from the pass told them that Tormund's brave sacrifice had bought them time, but not victory. They had perhaps an hour before their enemies reached the sanctuary's hidden entrance. "There is much to do and little time to do it," Sigrid continued, gesturing for them to follow her into the hall. "The knowledge that must be passed to you cannot be rushed, but neither can it be delayed. Come, and let us begin what should have taken years to accomplish." Inside the hall, Astrid gasped at the sight that greeted them. The walls were lined with shelves containing more books than she had ever imagined existed. Volumes bound in leather and metal, scrolls wrapped in silk, tablets carved from stone and wood. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years filled every available space, representing the collected knowledge of countless Völur who had devoted their lives to preserving what must not be lost. But it was the sword that drew Elska's attention, a weapon unlike any Astrid had ever seen, hanging above the central hearth, where it caught the light filtering through the hall's windows. The blade was forged from steel so pure it seemed to glow within a fire, and its edges had been honed to a sharpness that appeared capable of cutting through the very air itself. This was not a weapon of war, but a ceremonial blade, the sword that marked the passage from student to master, from seeker to keeper of ancient truths. "The blade of wisdom," Sigrid said, following Elska's gaze, "forged by the first Völur from metal that fell from the stars themselves. It has been waiting for its next bearer, waiting for one whose courage and vision make her worthy to wield it." Elska stepped forward, her hand extended toward the weapon with a certainty that surprised even her mother. The moment her fingers closed around the hilt, the blade seemed to come alive, its steel singing with harmonics that resonated in their very bones. Light poured from the metal, not harsh or blinding, but warm and welcoming, like sunrise after the longest night. "The transformation has begun," Sigrid said with satisfaction. "But there is more, much more that must be accomplished before our enemies arrive." The ancient Völva moved with surprising speed for one of her years, gathering books and scrolls from the shelves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment through decades of careful planning. She pressed volumes into Astrid's hands, texts on herb lore and healing, on the reading of signs and portents, on the songs that could mend broken hearts and broken bones alike. This knowledge lives not in the books alone, but in the understanding that comes from practice and wisdom, Sigrid explained as she worked. "You, Astrid, carry the experience needed to give these teachings meaning. Your daughter carries the vision needed to see how they might grow and change, to meet the challenges of times yet to come." From outside came the sound of hoofbeats on stone, the ringing challenge of warriors demanding entry to the sacred valley. Gunnar's forces had found them at last, and the final confrontation could no longer be delayed. "They cannot enter the sanctuary itself," Sigrid said calmly, showing no fear at the approaching threat. "This place is protected by wards older than memory, blessed by powers that recognize only those who come in peace and wisdom. But they can lay siege to us, can try to starve us out, or force us to surrender what we have sworn to protect." Ragnar lifted his father's axe, its runes blazing with reflected light from Elska's blade. "Then we make our stand here," he said simply. Together, as we were meant to, the moment of ultimate testing had arrived, and they faced it as they had faced every challenge, united by bonds stronger than steel, protected by wisdom older than the mountains themselves. 6 months after the siege of the sanctuary, the new home that Astrid, Elska, and Ragnar had built together nestled in a peaceful valley, far from the violence that had marked their journey. The hearthstone at its center was a thing of beauty, a massive piece of granite that Ragnar had quarried himself from the living rock of the mountainside, carved with protective runes and blessed by the wisdom that now flowed through all their lives like a hidden river. The siege itself had lasted only 3 days. Gunnar's forces, faced with the impossibility of breaching the sanctuary's ancient wards and the unwavering determination of its defenders, had eventually retreated to seek easier victories elsewhere. The would-be conqueror had learned, as many before him, that some treasures could not be taken by force. They could only be given freely to those who proved themselves worthy. The old Volva Sigrid had passed peacefully in her sleep 2 months. Later, her spirit departing with the quiet satisfaction of one who had completed her life's work. She had lived long enough to see the knowledge transfer completed, to witness Astrid's growing mastery of the healing arts and Elska's remarkable development as a seer and wise woman. The torch had been passed, the circle completed, the ancient wisdom secured for future generations. "Mother, you're smiling again," Elska observed as she entered their common room, carrying an armload of scrolls from the extensive library they had transported from the sanctuary. At 22 now, she carried herself with the confident grace of a woman who had found her true calling. The blade of wisdom hung at her side, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of the responsibility she had willingly accepted. "I was thinking about how far we've all come," Astrid replied, looking up from the herb garden plans she had been sketching. "A year ago, we were simple village women living quiet lives. Now look at us, guardians of ancient knowledge, healers and teachers, part of something larger than ourselves." The changes in their lives went far beyond their new roles and responsibilities. The bond between mother and daughter had deepened into something approaching partnership, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Elska no longer chafed against her mother's protection, understanding now that true strength came not from rejecting guidance, but from knowing when to follow it and when to forge new paths. And there was Ragnar, who had evolved from captor to protector to something that defied easy definition. He was not quite husband to Astrid. That relationship was still too new, too tentative to bear such weight, but he was certainly more than friend or ally. The three of them had become a family of choice, bound together by shared trials and common cause in ways that felt both inevitable and miraculous. "I received word from the northern settlements today," Ragnar said, entering the room with the measured step of a man who had found peace after years of carrying burdens too heavy for one person. 3 more young women have been identified with the site, daughters of fishing families who have begun to dream of events before they happen, who can read the meanings in cloud formations and bird flights. "Will you bring them here?" Astrid asked. "Only if they choose to come," he replied. The old ways of forcing such knowledge on the unwilling died with Eric and Gunnar. From now on, those who would learn the Völva's arts must come of their own accord, drawn by genuine calling rather than external compulsion. It was a philosophy that had guided all their work since establishing their new home. Rather than seeking to recreate the isolated sanctuary hidden in the high mountains, they had built something different, a place of learning that welcomed seekers while remaining connected to the wider world. Villagers came to them for healing and guidance, traders brought news from distant lands, and scholars arrived seeking to understand the connections between old wisdom and new knowledge. Elska set down her scrolls and moved to the great window that looked out over their valley. "Sometimes I dream of her," she said quietly. "Ingrid. She comes to me in visions, showing me things that haven't happened yet. Places we'll travel, people we'll help, knowledge we'll discover." "What does she tell you?" Ragnar asked, his voice soft with the wonder that always accompanied mentions of his lost love. "That love creates bridges between all realms," Elska replied. "That what we do here echoes across time in ways we can't imagine. That every person we heal, every young woman we teach, every bit of wisdom we preserve sends ripples out into the world that will touch lives we'll never know." As if summoned by their conversation, the evening light streaming through the window caught the hearthstone's carved runes, causing them to glow briefly with the warm radiance of a forge fire. It was a reminder that their home was built on more than stone and timber. It rested on the accumulated strength of all who had come before, all who had chosen love over fear, wisdom over ignorance, hope over despair. The iron bracelet was gone, given to the sacred grove's ancient oak, but its legacy lived on in the unbreakable bonds that connected this chosen family. The rune pendant hung now not around Elska's neck, but above their shared hearth, a blessing on all who entered their home. The golden threads were woven into the very fabric of their new life, visible in the tapestries that warmed their walls and the protective knots that guarded their doorways. As darkness settled over the valley and they gathered around their hearthstone for the evening meal, Astrid felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal accomplishment and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. They had saved something precious from destruction, created something lasting from chaos, built something beautiful from the raw materials of love and loss and hope. The story that had begun with a mother's desperate offer to sacrifice herself for her child had become something far larger, a testament to the truth that the strongest foundations are built not on individual heroism, but on the connections that bind us to one another across all the boundaries that seek to divide us. Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and the mountain winds carried the whispered voices of all who had walked this path before them, all who would follow in times yet to come.